So first off, thank all of you, Katie, Caitlin, Eric, for jumping on board today. As I told the three of you, I want to make sure that I start this off in the right way, and reflecting on a lot of the current events that have been happening across sports business. Obviously, there's a very specific NFL team that we can speak to, but just seeing a lot of women across sports step up on social media to talk about some of the challenge they face, it really forced me to be very reflective of the time that I spent on the team side or on the league side. And along the way, I always thought I was part of the answer. I wanted to leave my teams a little more diverse than when I left them. But as I kept reflecting on it and seeing some of the things like, Katie tweeted and some of the women tweeted, I realized, I was a part of the problem too. And that was really important for me to internalize and say out loud. And as I look back on it, I know there was two very specific areas where I did not help women in a professional sports space or a sales space. And the first was just getting caught up in the toxic masculinity that was happening around me, having a lot of white men around me. A lot of times in sports, you can get caught up in that environment. And I know the mistakes I made in some of those places, not just with what I said, but more often allowing other people to do it and say it and not step up in that place. And the second part was just being uneducated. I'm not a woman. I'm not educated about what are those things specifically that are hurtful or wrong or knock at women in the workplace or undercut them in the workplace. And so making an effort now to be more knowledgeable, be more thoughtful. I wanted to create a podcast, and I'm so glad we have the group of people that we have here. As an entry-level sales rep, whether I was a guy or a girl, obviously I'm a guy, what would I have needed to know to understand so I could have created the best possible working environment for the people that I was sitting next to and eventually going on to lead. So thankful that we have everyone here. Caitlin, I know we talked about your role in the notes, but as a manager of diversity and inclusion on a sales floor, how do you guys at HubSpot look at and define toxic masculinity in the sales environment?
Yeah, I mean, very similar to the sports world, tech sales is very white and very male driven. And so when I came into my role 3 years ago, I'll say it was a bit of a culture shock that I came in, and as I started doing kind of listening tours just around all of our offices, the things that kept popping up was bro culture, lad culture is what they called it in Dublin. In our JPAC offices, it was called gym culture. And so I really had to kind of dig in there. And while we might not necessarily define that as toxic masculinity, we do talk a lot about just kind of that male dominated bro culture. And so breaking that down, it means, there's a lot of locker room talk, a lot of, young professionals coming right out of college, right from their fraternities, and bringing that same environment onto the sales floor. And so we had to really kind of walk that behavior back as well. A lot of labeling when if a male didn't get a promotion, they could start kind of this rumor mill of like, oh, she only got hired, or they only got hired because she's a woman or they're a person of color. A lot of like labeling diversity hires. And so I think a lot of the behaviors that we were seeing at HubSpot and still, see in pockets to this day are much more of the subtle toxic masculinity traits that happen, of just kind of that whisper rumor mill that can happen, dominant personalities, and that can overpower maybe some quieter women, or again, trying to have those like really typical gender roles. And so a lot of it is subtle work that I have to kind of combat, but I say, well, we have come a long way in the 3 years that I've been here, and made some really great strides.
That's awesome. And I mean, I huge credit to your organization for taking that on, and not just globally, but very specifically taking that on within a sales organization, which, a lot of those environments have been like celebrated in movies, right? Like Glengarry Glen Ross or The Goods, or when you see it publicly, Wolf of Wall Street, like when you see it sometimes a sales boiler room, when you see it depicted, it is an environment that is like that, and it's almost celebrated. So congrats to you for tackling that and taking that heads on. And so I want to open the floor here a little bit. I think what's really important is that we understand before we kind of grow strategically, we think tactically. Katie, it was one of your tweets that I saw that really got me thinking and got me down that spiraling path, and why we're talking today. And Eric, I know you've led sales organizations, and I know you're doing a lot of work now outside of that to improve the mental health of a lot of organizations across sports, and individuals across sports. So for everyone here, what are some of those and anybody jump in. What are some of those real tactical things that you've seen on the floor? I know Caitlin did a good job of outlining a couple of them, but what are some things that you've seen or you've heard, or your friends have seen or your friends have heard that have had such a negative impact on them as women individually in the workplace?
Katie, you want to go first?
Yeah, I think one of the things that Caitlin really touched on, which translate a lot into the sports industry, is she talked about this bro culture or this gym culture. And one of the things that, you know, when I first started out that I heard was like this boys club. And, you know, when I was young, I was, you know, just starting out, I was like, no, like, that's not true. Like, they're just, maybe they haven't found someone that, you know, they could promote, or maybe they weren't qualified enough. But there really is this boys club within organizations, and it exists some places, it doesn't exist other places. And a lot of the times what they do is, you know, you hire somebody that thinks the same way as you and has the same thought process, and there's no diversity, there's no women, there's, like Brett talked about earlier, there's no people coming from different cities, different backgrounds, things like that. So a lot of times it's kind of like being bullied, if that makes sense. So you've got one, you know, maybe one person in leadership who says one thing, and then, you know, it kind of trickles down to the other managers and the other people. And it's just, there's comments that are made that aren't intentional. It may be, I can think specifically an account that I said, hey, you know, I don't feel comfortable, this person has made XYZ comment. And instead of addressing the situation, it was, well, let's just reassign the account to a male. Let's just, instead of just correcting the behavior, it's just like, hey, let's just move this on, and like, we'll just give them a new point of contact. Or, you know, some colleagues saying, hey, this person won't renew an account because I won't go on a date with them. And instead of somebody stepping up and saying, hey, this isn't okay, let's just reassign the account and they'll just renew with somebody else. And those are not examples of myself, but some other stories that have been shared with some of my former colleagues.
Yeah, you know, I think in discussing this topic, you almost have to look at it scary enough as your employee base and then your leadership team. Because the fascinating thing is that what your leadership team looks like and how they carry themselves very much dictates what your employee base does, right? And so that interaction between the two. And I'm thinking, I didn't want to prepare too much for this because I wanted to think to what you all were saying as you were saying it, so I could give the most, you know, genuine responses. And so as you're talking, you know, my mind's going to, okay, first job out of college was for the NBA league office. And in a way, I was fortunate because that was a pretty progressive organization, even in the early 2000s, where you had, you know, Brenda Spoonmore was the head of our information technology group for all the NBA, where Heidi Uberoth, who's Peter Uberoth's daughter, was the head of all of global marketing partnerships. On top of Mark Tatum and Jonathan Press, the two guys who ran kind of the mini departments underneath her, and we see where Mark is now as a deputy commissioner. And so early on, I saw that, you know, there was inclusion of females at a very high level. And then the first position that I took after that at a team was with a WNBA team, it was with the Chicago Sky, where it was, I would say, female dominated in those aspects. If I had to look at the number of employees that were there, our CEO was a female, our CMO was a female. We had a finance guy who was a male. But so I didn't really get the full indoctrination into the toxic masculinity culture. And this is not talking that organization down. I think they produced some of the best sales leaders out there, but it was when I went to the Suns was the next stop. And it was the Suns and Mercury and the Phoenix Roadrunners. And, you know, talk about diversity. He was a white male, but he's since been one of the biggest figures in sports to come out as openly gay. So there's diversity there. But Rick Welts was our CEO. John Walker was our CMO at the time. And you know, the female leadership in the sales part of things wasn't really there as much, right? Like Drew Cloud was leading our sales department. Jeff Einell and myself were hired on the director level side of things. And then the women were in the WNBA team side. Jay Perry was the president of the Phoenix Mercury, and Amber Cox, who's now with with Connecticut was just underneath Jay. And so it was like this separate world of like, okay, the men are managing the male team, the women are managing the women's team. And so I think what I started to see at that point, that like going back in time, this was, 2007 to 2010, was with the Sons of Mercury. The little seedlings of what we're seeing now started to take place. Like every guy in the office is dressing the same way in a blue pinstripe suit and brown shoes, right? And it's like, okay, you're all following each other. You're all holding yourself in a certain way. And especially, look, I'm part of the issue here too, like being in Scottsdale, that's a culture where a lot of young people go, and it's like a mini Vegas almost in a way, is what Scottsdale's like. So another piece to this whole environment in the office conversation, I think, needs to also include what geographies are we working in, right? And how does that contribute to what the office culture and office setting is? Because I think what Caitlin started with, and then Katie, you just touched on with the bro culture in a way, when you are part of a friends group in college or in high school, even if we want to go that far back, right? The majority of your group that you hang out with, meaning just like when you're having relaxing time, not social time, is men are hanging out with men, women are hanging out with women. And so you're saying things in that circle that are comfortable amongst you, but might not be the most appropriate thing to say in a work setting. You now extrapolate that out and you get into a work setting where the majority of people that you're working with are of the same sex. It's almost like your senses are still the same and you have to check yourself. You're now a professional. Like the things that you talked about, you're talking about them. I heard the term before, like in the locker room or something like that. Those aren't appropriate things to bring up in an office setting. I would even say amongst coworkers that are of the same sex, having a conversation about females when you're out to lunch or something like that is also something that's very problematic, right? So I know I haven't gone too deep just yet, because we'll dive into more as we go into the conversation, but I do think leadership is a big piece of it. What does your leadership look like? What's it made up of? And then from the leadership, geographically, where are you set up, and the numbers game in your employee base, does that lend itself towards you thinking, this is the same type of environment I've been hanging out with for such a long period of time. Okay, business as usual. And that business as usual is not the right business to be playing.
Yeah, I think that's one of the points you made in there. I was just thinking back on it, was what you talked about. There's this like chain, right? Like I played sports growing up. I did that through high school. I played in college. I was around the fraternity scene at Hamilton College, which is very white and male. And so that culture has kind of bred me along the way to speak a certain way and act a certain way and do certain things, especially when females aren't dominantly around. And then obviously we get into sports and all of a sudden it's a lot more people in sales that look like me. So from an educational standpoint, Caitlin, how do you guys think about breaking that chain or that cycle as you go through it? Because I mean, just like a lot of sports teams, you guys hire a lot of entry level people out of college onto the sales team. And what are some of the things that you guys work on to make sure that those people are conscious about the environment they left and the environment that they're now in?
Yeah, I mean, we do a lot, Eric. I was just like nodding vigorously to everything that you were saying, because we can relate so much to that at HubSpot, where having a young sales population is really great. And some of the relationships that you're building at work tend to bleed into your personal life and kind of vice versa. And what I often say to a lot of people in my training is like, I can't control what you're doing in your personal life. I don't care what you do outside of work, but like when you are in HubSpot, you are in a workplace. This is a place of work where we are going to be held to a certain standard. And the things that you say at the bar on Friday nights with your friends have no place here at work. And so I run this one training called Be an Upstander, Not a Bystander. And it's all about kind of bystander intervention. So calling out exclusive behavior when you see it. And so many people bring up examples of like, well, I heard this person make this comment the other day, whether it was like a homophobic slur, a sexist slur, a racial slur, and they're all just hanging with the guys. And I saw the VP heard it, the manager heard it, and no one chose to step in. And so Eric, to kind of your point about leadership needing to be involved, this training also empowers them to call out exclusive behavior when they see it, because really you're going to follow the behavior of your manager is going to follow the behavior of your VP. And if the people at the very top aren't living and breathing this inclusive behavior that we want to see day in and day out, then we're not going to make any progress. But Brett, to answer your original question, how we kind of make sure that we're diversifying our teams and not just hiring for this culture of sameness, it takes a real strong effort. And so, 3 years ago, I'll say, when I first started, we were recruiting from the same schools. So really just focused on our entry-level talent for the purpose of this conversation. We're recruiting from the same schools, which are primarily white, primarily male. They have, business programs that are again filled with white males. And so not to say that these people weren't fantastic salespeople, because they absolutely were, but they just were not helping. Fishing in the same pond was not helping us really set the tone for diversity. And we weren't building diverse teams that were going to bring diverse perspectives and ultimately help us get better, help us be a better sales team. And so we have made investments in campus recruiting. We've made investments in training for our recruiters to make sure that we are really making that conscious effort to bridge outside of just the area of New England. Boston itself is an incredibly white city. And so we have to move outside of Boston. We need to move outside of New England. We've put a lot of effort into remote hiring, which I think was a point you brought up earlier, Brett, of making sure that we're not just looking at our own communities that we're existing in, but we're recruiting from all of the US and we're expanding that globally as well, because again, that's where we're going to find the diversity that we're looking for and people that are really going to bring a unique perspective to our sales team. One thing that we're doing this year in particular is we're prioritizing recruiting at historically Black colleges and universities. So that's one commitment that we're making to ensure that we are going to reach a diverse student population that we want to see, that is going to help us make our sales team more reflective of our global diverse customer base. And so much of this has to happen at every single level of recruiting, but in particular to make sure that we're filling our pipeline and filling our entry-level talent with people that are going to bring all these different unique perspectives. Our campus plays are one of the many areas that we're trying to do that.
I love that. I think that's particularly awesome. And one question I'd ask you, Katie, is, and Caitlin, feel free to jump in on this one too. I think I've never been a woman on a sales floor, so it's never going to be a perspective I have, right? And I know it's not a day in, day out, minute in, minute out, second in, second out thing that you're conscious of, but what have been those things in your career, or those moments in your career where it stood out to you that you're a woman and that's a lot of men? Like, I'd be interested to hear those. And I think especially for the guys that are going to be listening in on this podcast that really want to make positive steps, I think this is a really important part of the conversation, because I'm sure my biggest mistakes came from either not standing up and stepping up, like Caitlin, you talked about doing that class, but I think even more of them came from just not being educated. And I know the example I used with you all before was, I can't tell you how many more times I've used "she'll be great" in front of a client than "he'll be great" in front of a client. Like, I would say the numbers are probably in the hundreds to one. And so I think of myself, and I think that example for me, what are some of the ones that have stood out? Obviously, and I'm a male, what are the ones that have stood out very specifically for you all as women?
I think for me, kind of stepping back to your first question, I think there's a lot of times early on in my career where, I'd look around in a room and I'd be like, man, I'm the only girl in here. And, it's one of those things where you get kind of numb to it, where it's just like you're used to it, to where now when I go into meetings and there's 3, 4, 5 women, I'm like, all right, like, I've got some more women in here. I've got some more people who, are an ally, if you will. And so that was kind of the first time that I had thought about just being a woman. But for me, if you want to work in sports, it's kind of one of those things where it's a hurdle. Or if you want to work in sports and you want to pursue a career in sports, like, you kind of already know you're going to be a minority. You already know that you're going to be one of few. And I forget the question that you asked me, Brett, at the tail end. But that was kind of the first time that I noticed it. And now you're just used to it. Now you're just like, okay, I'm the only girl. I'm going to have to speak up. I'm going to have to be louder. I'm going to have to, you just don't really think about it anymore.
I mean, so I think this is an even more important question. Like psychologically, when the two of you walk into a room full of men, and psychologically when you walk into a room that has more diversity, obviously women primarily, like what are the differences for you personally in both of those environments? And I think we're talking to two women overcome some of those things, but I'd like harken back to your early days walking into some of those environments and how you felt versus all of a sudden being in a room where there's more women.
I think it's very intimidating. It makes you feel like if you speak up, you don't really have an ally on your side who maybe would share your same opinion. Because there's a lot of times where, I'll be in a meeting or in a setting where I'm the only female, and I'll make a comment or share my opinion or perspective, and it's very different from what everybody else thinks. And when you do have more females in the room, you almost feel like someone can back you up or someone can justify what you're saying. Whereas when you're in a room full of, all males, if they don't agree or they don't see your opinion, it's just like, okay, well, majority wins. So just right off the bat, for me, it's very intimidating.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree, Katie. Like, I think the word is intimidating. I think that just nails it perfectly. I look back to the early days in my career and being 22, right out of college, the only female on an all-male team. And just one example of toxic masculinity that I've come across is, in the early days in that job, I would go out to lunch with my coworkers, and it's at a university, we'd be in the university cafeteria, and the very senior guy on the team that was kind of taking all of us new people under his wing, would start to make comments about females' physical appearance of like other women that worked at the university that he saw in the cafeteria, and like, kind of like wink, wink, nudge, nudge the other guys right at the lunch table that I was sitting at. And it made me feel like, well, I'm brand new here. He's incredibly senior. I can't call him out because I feel like I don't have a voice, and I'm someone that was raised to have a voice. I've always had a voice, and I felt so helpless in that situation. And so what happened to me in that role was I removed myself from that team. I became incredibly isolated. I didn't hang out with them. I didn't go to lunch with them. And then I ultimately left because I hated working there. And so coming to HubSpot, I have certainly been the only female in the room. And when, as we've started to diversify the sales leadership team and there are more women in leadership roles, I am seeing more women at the management level. I am just seeing more people that are bringing just unique perspectives to the table in general. I would say just a feeling of like psychological safety for sure, that I can be a little bit more myself, that I can find my voice, I can have that, quote unquote equal seat at the table. But I would also just say it's like a sense of relief. It's not feeling intimidated anymore. And like the sales leadership team are lovely people. Do not get me wrong. But if you don't have an ally, if you don't have a sponsor in the room, and like you're just getting kind of hammered with difficult questions and no one is there to speak up on your behalf or to kind of help elevate your voice, it can be really challenging. And so I think that the importance of diverse leadership teams is just to give more people that sense of safety, that sense of like, I belong here and I know I'm going to be supported here.
And Eric, especially psychologically, and I know you can speak this better anyway, like what are the psychological benefits of safety to a sales organization? Because I think it's important that we understand this. And I can tell you for sure, the most diverse sales teams that I worked with, whenever our teams were more diverse at the National Sales Center when I was there, once we got our team more diverse at the Columbus Crew, we were better. We were just better sales teams. So why are more diverse sales teams psychologically better sales teams?
The most looked at research article on the topic in a work setting is this research by Google. It's called Project Aristotle. And I've talked about it a couple of times, I think, when we've had other podcasts, but essentially they controlled for other factors, and they measured things like title of employees, pay scale of employees, tenure of employees, right? Past years of experience of employees. And then they looked at this topic of psychological safety. And psychological safety, depending on what the organization considered to be a barometer of success, the most successful organizations were the ones where people rated high on psychological safety, and it didn't matter any of those other factors, like totally across the board on all the different teams. You could have a young staff of people all coming with new ideas who got no experience, but they feel safe with one another. So, right. So as Caitlin's giving her explanation of what happened at the table, that she ended up leaving that team and then leaving that job, right? So you think about it and you say, okay, why does a male manager feel comfortable saying that when there's a female employee at the table, right? That the male manager probably shouldn't be saying that whether there's a female there or not, but that they're feeling comfortable saying that when there is a female at the table. And the reason is because, look, this is me playing armchair psychologist, but it's a bro mentality right now. Like, she's one of the guys. She's able to hang. She could get that, like, we're making that comment, right? But what that does is, even though Caitlin, for multitude of reasons in the workplace, because you don't want to be the whistleblower, because you want to keep moving forward in your job and you don't want to be looked at as that person. There are men who think, oh, that woman on my staff is never going to say anything, and she's one of the guys anyway, so I could keep talking that way. But there's case in point that what you're doing by making those comments is you're making that person feel unsafe. That person then, in feeling unsafe, isn't going to work as hard, not because they're trying to do it despite the organization, but because it's just hard to be motivated to work for someone that you look at in that way. And then that person ends up deciding to leave, and talk about, like, how bad for an organization turnover is and how much more it takes to hire someone new and train them. It's a pretty bad, cycle to get into. And I think, we've talked a lot about leadership. The fascinating thing is, like, the three of us, Katie and Brett, we're in sports organizations. Caitlin is in a sales tech organization. But I think anytime you talk about sales, right, a lot of the pool that we recruit from and people who are drawn towards sales have some kind of athletic background. Why do they have some kind of athletic background? Because they're competitive. So competitive people end up being good salespeople, right? Now, with that competitive background, though, then you get into the office. And here's what I find fascinating about sports. Like, the psychology of the sports office is so interesting, but I'm sure Caitlin, and just sales in general is interesting, is you've got these, group of 50 people, 80 people, whatever it is, that are all at the same level, that have been used to being the top competitor and top producer at what they do their entire life. And then all of a sudden they're like, oh shit, I have to outperform everyone else. I have to be the first one to get that next promotion to become an account executive, and then beat those people out to show that I'm a good people person to get the manager role, then beat those people out from a strategic standpoint to get the director role. Like, it's hilarious, because you got people who, like, are so used to, I could outwork and out hustle anyone and become the starting player and the biggest scorer on this team. It's like, no, you can't do that right away. You have to check yourself first, right? And you'd think that'd be a good thing. And it is a little bit at first. But the toxicity of that, whether you call it male toxicity or whether you call it just toxicity, is it stems all the way from the top. Because what have we defined leaders as? And this is where, I'll put my mental health hat on for a second, especially in this space for so long. A leader is the person who's the Teflon Don, like, there's no chink in their armor. They have nothing that you could talk about from a vulnerability standpoint has ever happened to them in their life. They charge forward. They have this myopic focus, and nothing impacts them, right? Well, if that's the mentality, what actually upsets me about women who have to work in that environment is women are having to play into this culture where men have defined what a leadership position looks like. And I'll even say, without naming names, some of the women who become very high leaders in sports organizations have done it by playing the role of how the male leader is looked at, instead of, there's so many attributes of a female. Look, men and women are different. There's attributes of a female that I think could make an organization be incredibly well run, specifically because there's a woman running the organization, right? But, like, it's no, sorry, they can't be that way, the way that they have been. They have to be this way because now in this toxic environment, this is what the CEO has looked like. This is what the COO and the CMO have looked like. So you have to follow that path exactly in those footsteps. And now you're not wearing the black pinstripe suit and brown shoes, but you're wearing the female equivalent of that. And you have to talk in a certain way, and it has to be this perfect way. And you also have to show no emotion. So like, even with the hires that we're bringing in, it's great that, okay, more women being hired, but like, if we're not practicing what we preach from a leadership perspective in terms of vulnerability, care, psychological safety, all those things, all we're doing is we're asking women to conform to a male environment.
And I'd say this, Caitlin, I bet when you weren't at the table, or you walked away from the table, or you walked away from the organization, I'm sure the conversation wasn't like internal soul searching, like, what did we do? I'm sure the conversation, right, was like, well, that's her fault. Like, she can't hang, she can't take it, she can't do that. And I think to Eric, like, that's just the definitions, right? Like, of what it means to be an employee, what it means to be a leader. That's just the definitions being screwed up from the start. So I think, you know, my question is I know there's going to be a lot of organizations, and we talked about this, like, the organizations are going to say, you know what, that's right, that's good. We talked about this before. They're going to make some hires to say that we're trying this. They may say we're moving too fast to make cultural shift. We're making too fast to make cultural change. Obviously, that's crap. Like, they don't have to make large things to start making those changes. But, you know, Caitlin, especially for you guys, and obviously you guys are making some broad things now, but what were some of the first smaller changes that were made potentially at HubSpot? And Katie, what are some of those smaller things that you've seen that have just, from a cultural standpoint and an environment standpoint, that have really impressed you about your current organizations, or things that people can do that they may not be thinking about? And Eric too, for sure.
Yeah, to get us started, I think, you know, coming in, I listened a lot. And so I think listening to employees and really hearing their experiences and being open to hearing their experiences is a great first step. I think you can't change what you don't know. And so after those listening tours, again, kind of what came out of them was that we had a big problem at the manager level, which I think I alluded to a little bit earlier, that our managers were in positions of management because they were fantastic BDRs that became fantastic reps, and they crushed it at the rep role. And so, yeah, they got promoted into management, but we did them a disservice because we didn't teach them how to be great managers. And so right around the time that I started, we actually invested in a management and leadership team as well, which has done fantastic work for managers across the board. But for me to tackle our sales managers and kind of get them on board with our mission of diversity and inclusion and the importance of it, it took a lot of education. And so I would say education has to also be kind of one of your first steps, that you need to really make sure that folks are open to learning about the power of inclusion, the power of belonging, the importance of diversity. And then once you get them kind of on board with the education, and not everyone is going to be on board, it's not going to happen overnight. It took me, I would say, 1.5 years to even get to that point. Then kind of your next year and 1.5 years in the role has to be reiterating. And that's where like leadership plays a huge part, so that you're not just sending a manager through a training, you're not just having them, you know, read this article and expecting them to be great at diversity and inclusion. You have to be building in these measures of accountability as well. So how are you as the VP or director of that management team leading by example and holding them accountable for attending those trainings, for not only attending, but demonstrating those behaviors after the fact on their teams? And so we also do a lot of surveys at HubSpot. And I'm proud to say that last summer, after, again, like 2.5 years of doing this work, we were finally able to prove that teams in sales that were diverse and focused on inclusion outperformed teams that weren't. And so if a manager doesn't believe the McKinsey data or the Forbes data that I'm throwing at them on a really frequent basis, we actually have been able to prove it internally, that teams that are diverse and inclusive throughout HubSpot sales perform better. And so, I mean, it was a journey to get there, but I think data really helps when talking to a salesperson, and you're really numbers focused. And so I lean on data a lot, but it also has to just be that you have to actively listen, you have to provide some education, and then you have to push people to get involved. You have to hold them accountable for getting involved, to really ensure that you're driving this throughout the org. And it's not just going to be this kind of like flash in the pan, like we care about it this month, but like we're behind on our number and we have to prioritize other things this month. And like diversity and inclusion is typically the first thing that gets dropped off the priority list. And I think the more that you build in these measures, the more that it will stay a priority.
I think sometimes in sports, I think about like, we get really proud that we have a lot of 26, 27-year-old managers, right? Like, and people that are leading sales teams, but theoretically, is that the best? Is that best for the environment and the culture of the organization, that we take really young people and say, congratulations on all your sales success. Now you get to lead people. And a lot of what made them good in the first place was, you read the challenger sale, they're challenger sellers, they're lone wolf sellers, they're people that have a lot of times skewed what the training has been internally and did it their own way, which is why it stood out. And now all of a sudden you've got your own internal sales training, which is saying one thing, your leader is saying another thing, and he, for the most part, is 26, 27 years old and has no experience dealing with people in a meaningful way. And I think a lot of times that it isn't just that the leadership has to change at the senior level. It has to, that middle management level needs to be more educated. It needs to be more thoughtful about the people there. It needs to be more diligent about the people that we look there. Just because you're the best seller is not a qualification for being a good manager. In fact, a lot of times it's the complete opposite. And Eric, anything to add? Like, I know you've hired tons of managers.
Look, I mean, I mentioned that there's like different levels to look at it. Absolutely. I mean, I can't think of a manager we promoted to, let's say, the AE manager or the inside sales manager that was ever the top salesperson. And not because we thought if you're the top salesperson, you can't possibly have, people skills and the ability to motivate, manage, and create psychological safety and show vulnerability. But, to your point, like the hunters are usually the ones that were top of the board, and they cared about them. They cared about themselves and what their numbers were. And you need some of those folks on a sales team because they push everyone else and they're looking at the top of the board, and that's helpful to see that top of the board. But I think, like kind of going back to the bigger picture of stuff, like we were talking about this a little bit before the call with some of the folks who get hired. I really think like the senior level people are the ones who set the tone for the rest of the organization. And so I'll give you a personal example. I mentioned like starting at the MBA, being progressive. So I was at David Stern's funeral about 4 months or so ago. And a couple of people who spoke at his funeral were Val Ackerman. And everyone knows Val Ackerman as the first commissioner of the WNBA. Okay, there was a big Val Ackerman at the NBA before there was ever a WNBA commissioner, right? And then I mentioned Rick Welts. He wasn't just the president of the Suns. He was one of the early employees at the league office as well. And they both spoke, gave eulogies during the funeral. It was awesome. It was Magic Johnson and Pat Riley, right? All great speakers, but their two speeches in particular really resonated with me because the way that David hired, it didn't sound at all like Val was the female in the group, right? And Rick was the gay male in the group. Like it was each of them were a person that brought tremendous value to the organization. That was it. And they had a very small group when David took over the NBA. There were like 5 of them running the entire operations. And again, Val was like VP of business operations, right? The WNBA wasn't even on the radar at the time. And Rick told a story about how he was never open about his sexuality at that time. And I think like 4 or so years into working for David, he went back to Seattle and they had this fundraiser for his boyfriend in Seattle. I think it had something to do with they had a family member who had cancer. And so David's not supposed to know that's why he's going back, right? And there was a huge donation from the Stern family that showed up, there was no way that David would have been able to connect the dots on those things through the conversations he had with Rick. He obviously knew in some other way, but the point was, like, he didn't look at Rick as Rick's the gay guy on our staff, right? He didn't look at Val as the female on our staff. And you know, it's interesting to hear Katie and Caitlin talk about like being the only female on the staff and how that's intimidating, because I think if you do have a leader, no matter how small or large your organization is, that treats each individual, whatever their background is, right? And we live in a world where people now, it's not just their sex, it's what sex they identify even with, right? And so whatever their background is and whatever they identify with, it's treating each person like a person. If we're just hiring women or we're hiring someone in the LGBTQ community to check a box, and that person's in that spot and it's done for a PR purposes and it's done because it makes the organization look more diverse, I actually don't think it helps the organization to trickle down, because I think people in the organization can see the way that leader treats the individuals differently. Whereas when you treat every single person and you hire the best person, and the best person is someone that comes from a diverse category, that trickles down to everyone else, and everyone sees it, and everyone starts looking at each other like equals, regardless of what the numbers are in terms of percentages and stuff like that.
Yeah, it's funny. So I mean, a lot of people don't know this, but I actually kind of followed Eric to Teambo. And I think, you know, now that you talk about it and mention it, I think that's one of the things that stands out the most about it was just how dynamic that group was. You know, when I was there, we had people like Donna Daniels, we had Lil, we had
Stacey
Lauren
McWilliams.
Yeah, Stacey McWilliams, we had KB, Kristen Berner, we had Amy Brooks, like, but not just that, we also had like minor league baseball people that were there, and we had like consultants that were there. I came from a corporate sales background. Like, it wasn't just, and I think this is something we talked about before that I think is just critical. It's not just diversity for the sake of diversity. It's diversity because all of those viewpoints matter to what shapes a positive culture.
And even the men, I know I'm talking a lot here, and then I'll let Caitlin talk about, like, even the men that are hired in Teambo, like a Jerry Murphy who's been there forever. Jerry Murphy loves working in the WNBA because he loves helping people and getting them better. He doesn't have this toxic masculinity about him where he's like, oh, I feel slighted because I haven't gotten the NBA job. You know what I mean? So diversity inclusion also, and breaking down the toxic masculinity isn't just who we hire from diverse categories. It's also in white men. What motivates them? What gets them up in the morning? What are they excited by? And how does that show equality amongst everyone, instead of just, this is the one path, this is the way that we always go, I want to be this top person at the NBA all the time.
It's so it's so interesting, because when I think about when I first started in professional sports and inside sales, and, you know, right out of college, not really sure what to expect, I feel like it was very much a culture, or kind of already set in place, that, you know, you work hard, you do your job, you put your head down, you know, don't make too much of a fuss, and you go home and you hope to get promoted, and all these things. And now I feel like what you're seeing is this like change in a sales culture where you speak up, which is part of the reason I wanted to jump on this podcast, is because, you know, if we're going to have allies in the office, you know, in the office, outside the office, you need to bring awareness to it. And so I think that's what you're seeing in a sales culture nowadays, is that more people are speaking up, and more people are younger people, they are people who are seeing something, they're saying something. And so I think that there's this great shift of, you know, if something's not right, let's stop it in its track and let's change it, and like let's fix the issue and not just put a band-aid over it. Like, let's talk about it, let's take action, let's take steps, which is really encouraging from when I first started.
I mean, I love that. I mean, that's a really cool place to end on too, right? Like, I mean, I think this is one of those topics that, you know, we could get really in the weeds with, we could get really strategic with, but I think, you know, that's a really good place to kind of end it. And I kind of throw a last word out, you know, for each of you. I know this conversation isn't going to change the sports landscape, but or the sales landscape, but, you know, what are a couple things from a walk away point that if a rep was listening to this, they got to the end of the call, you know, especially Katie and Caitlin, but, you know, certainly speak to this, Eric, what are what are a couple things that you hope that they would get out of this conversation that they can take back to their culture and their environment? Katie, we'll start with you.
I think it's just bringing awareness to it. You know, I know we talked a little bit about the tweet that I sent that kind of had this snowball. And I think it's just bringing awareness. You know, I had a lot of positive feedback from just sharing other people's story, because most of the time it just gets swept under the rug. Like, somebody makes a comment, you shrug it off, you move on, you really don't say much about it. And I think just bringing awareness to it, so that when something does happen or something's said, or there's a situation that comes up, you know, you have somebody that you've already maybe had this conversation with, who's now an ally and will say something, or they'll stick up for you, or they'll really be on your side when something does arise. So I think bringing awareness, having the conversation is a really good place to start, and hopefully moving forward obviously goes further than that.
Taylor?
Yeah, that was great, Katie. Brett, I think to the way you just even opened this podcast today was saying that, like, I have been part of the problem in the past. And I think what I hope people will walk away with from today is the fact that, like, it's okay to have made mistakes in the past. We all have. We've all said something or done something that in today's day and age could be considered inappropriate or exclusive. And it's all about kind of learning and growing. And I think understanding our own behavior and making sure that just moving forward, we'll strive to be better, and understand that while our intent for saying or doing something may not have been malicious, that intent doesn't equal impact always. And so understanding the impact that these comments that you're making, or these rumors that you're starting, or this behavior that you're exhibiting in a meeting or in just an office setting, while you being in the majority, you may not think twice about what you're saying or what you're doing, but the impact that your actions can have can be so detrimental to anyone that is in the minority, or even people that are in the majority too. And it can cause them to really feel excluded or lose this sense of inclusion or belonging. And so I think it's people being willing to accept that they've not been perfect in the past, and they're probably not going to be perfect moving forward, but they're going to commit to being more aware. They're going to commit to understanding how their actions have impact, and being willing to just say, I'm sorry, I'm going to strive to do better. That's what I hope people would really take away from this.
Yeah. I would just round it all out with everyone's comments just by saying, you know, a leader's role is to be genuine. And in this space, which is a newish space in corporate work environment of diversity and inclusion, which let's hope that within that means breaking down toxic masculinity under its umbrella, it's not just hiring the Caitlins of the world. It sounds like she's got a great senior management team that actually believes in it. So when we check the box by hiring a diversity and inclusion manager, or not even doing that, but just hiring more diversity candidates, that's not enough anymore. The person who's in the leadership position or positions needs to actually care that the culture is changing in the office, because if not, that makes Caitlin's job almost impossible, because what it does is it's basically saying we're going to check the box on it and we're going to say we're doing it because this is the right thing to do, but the rest of the employees, like, they pick up on what's important to the senior management team. And you know, Caitlin probably, I'm sure, had, with those reports that she has, she can show all day that there's success in diverse groups. That's really important. You have a CEO who acts, let's say, the way that he did at the first job that Caitlin had. I don't know who that person is. It sounds like they weren't the CEO, but they're now walking what they talk. And then all the research, all the stuff that you're showing kind of goes down the drain because you know, their actions don't back it up. So that's what I would say is, if in a leadership position, this is going to be something that you're going to do, you could actually come off worse trying to hire candidates just for the sake of showing that you did it, because your culture could end up being worse because of it if you're not actually living it, which makes your productivity worse. And then why did you even get involved in making the changes in the first place?
Yeah, and first, I mean, before I close, I genuinely appreciate all of you I appreciate your organizations in a lot of ways for allowing you to speak up and speak out of this. I think that says a lot about obviously who you represent. I know Eric and I represent ourselves, so it's a little easier, but especially for Katie and Caitlin, I think it says a lot about your organizations that we're able to do this. And this all happened a little bit around last week, and this is not political at all, but I think one of the things that really hit me alongside this was, when Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez spoke up against the person that accosted her in the hallway. And one of the things that rubbed me deeply was, I think part of the badge that I hid behind, right, was like, well, I'm a good son, I'm a good friend, now I'm a good husband, I'm a good boyfriend, I'm a good father. And I think to Eric's point about leadership, it's not good enough to just say those things. It really does come down to your actions and the way that you treat people and the way that you think about people and the way that you're conscious about how you act every day and how you represent your parents the way that they want their son to act, how you represent your kids, how you represent your wife, your boyfriend, your girlfriend, whoever it is with the actions that you take. I think that speaks way louder. And my takeaway is I hope that if this helps some people be more conscious about the actions that they take, then we're going to have a much better environment than the ones that I was in when I started sales and even some of the sales teams that I led. So I'm genuinely appreciative for everyone on here. This is such a cool conversation. I think we could have done this for a couple hours, but like I said, maybe we'll be back. Maybe that'll be awesome. So thank all of you. I appreciate it.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much, Brett.
Thanks, Brett. Thanks, guys.
Great to meet you.
Bye, Brett. You as well.